For 10 years, the silence of Jacob Thorne's grief was his only companion until the day a federal marshal left 10 wounded Comanche children on his doorstep with a dire ultimatum. Wyoming Territory, High Plains, Autumn, 1878. The sun bled a weak, watery orange across the vast, lonely expanse, doing little to warm the wind that scoured the land. It was a wind that carried the scent of pine and dust and the coming bite of an early snow. It was a wind that knew Jacob's cabin well, for it had rattled its windows and whispered through its chinks for a decade of solitude. Inside, the cabin was a monument to a life suspended. A single chair, a single plate, a cot in the corner. Every surface was clean, not with the warmth of a lived-in home, but with the stark, methodical precision of a man who had nothing else to do. Jacob Thorne was a man carved from the same hard granite as the mountains that loomed to the west. His face was a map of sorrows he never spoke of, his eyes the color of a stormy sky. The war had left scars on his body, but the loss of his wife, Sarah, to the fever that swept through Laramie 10 years prior had hollowed out his soul. He had built this cabin with her, for her, and when she died, the life within it died too. He existed, he did not live. He chopped wood, hunted for his meals, and watched the seasons turn with the detached observation of a ghost. Then came the rattle of a wagon and the heavy tread of boots on his porch. Marshal Thompson, a man whose face was weary with the burdens of the so-called peace, did not waste time with pleasantries. He gestured with his thumb to the back of his wagon. Huddled together under a coarse blanket were 10 small figures. They were girls, none older than 12, their faces smudged with dirt and tear tracks, their dark eyes wide with a terror so profound it was utterly silent. Their clothes were torn, and the crude bandages wrapped around their arms and legs were stained with old blood. They were the last survivors of a cavalry raid on a hostile village, children deemed too much trouble for the reservation agents. Thompson's voice was flat, devoid of pity. "They're Comanche. Their people are gone. The Bureau wants them sent to a school back east, but they won't survive the journey like this. I heard you were a medic in the war. And that you keep to yourself." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the empty yard. "The government will pay you a stipend. Keep them until they're fit to travel. It's this, or they'll likely die on the road." He wasn't asking. He was delivering a burden. Jacob's jaw was a hard line. He looked from the marshal's uncaring face to the 10 pairs of terrified eyes in the wagon. He saw their wounds, the shivering frames, the silent plea that was not for mercy, but simply for an end to the pain. In their eyes, he saw a reflection of his own desolate landscape. For 10 years, he had protected the memory of his wife by shutting the world out. Now, the world, in its most vulnerable and broken form, had been deposited on his land. He gave a single, curt nod. It was not agreement. It was acceptance of a fate he did not choose. The marshal left without another word. The 10 girls were herded from the wagon, stumbling into the yard like frightened fawns. They huddled together, a small island of misery in the vast emptiness of Jacob's world. He stood on his porch, a stoic statue, the cold wind whipping his hair. He looked at the cabin he had built for one, then at the 10 small souls now in his charge. The silence he had cultivated for a decade was shattered, not by a sound, but by the overwhelming weight of their presence. The long, lonely quiet was over. The first few days were a study in silent, awkward cohabitation. Wyoming Territory, Thorne Homestead, Autumn, 1878. A fragile frost silvered the ground each morning, and the air grew sharper with each passing day. Jacob moved with the stiff, unnatural care of a man handling delicate glass. He was a soldier, a woodsman, a widower. He knew nothing of children. He cooked a large pot of stew, the aroma thick and unfamiliar in the Spartan cabin, and left it on the hearth with 10 wooden bowls he'd hastily carved. He fetched fresh water, changed their dirtiest bandages with brusque, impersonal efficiency, his large hands fumbling with the strips of cloth. He did not speak to them, and they did not speak to him. They ate with their heads bowed, their movements small and furtive. At night, they slept in a tight cluster on the floor near the fire, their soft, shallow breaths a constant, unnerving reminder of their existence. Jacob would lie on his cot, staring into the darkness, listening. He felt like an intruder in his own home. He was providing for their bodies, but their spirits remained locked away, their trauma a palpable entity in the small room. He saw the infection in a gash on one girl's leg, the feverish glint in another's eye, and felt a cold dread. He was failing them. He knew how to set a bone, to stitch a wound, but he did not know how to mend a broken heart. 3 days after the girl's arrival, a new figure appeared at the edge of the clearing, walking with a slow, weary gait. It was a woman, her dress torn at the hem and coated in the dust of a long journey. Her face was pale and drawn, but she held herself with a quiet dignity that defied her ragged appearance. This was Lena. She had fled the town of redemption, a place that had offered her none. Widowed young, she had been taken in by her late husband's cruel brother, a man who saw her as property. When she refused his advances, he had branded her with shame, turning the town against her with whispers and lies. She was an outcast, with nowhere left to go but the wilderness. Jacob saw her approach and his hand instinctively went to the axe handle leaning against the cabin. His territory had been breached twice in 1 week. He met her on the porch, his expression a granite wall. "Keep walking," he said. His voice was rough from disuse. Lena stopped. Her eyes, the color of moss after a rain, were not fearful. They were exhausted. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Just for a night." A storm is coming. Before Jacob could refuse again, the cabin door creaked open. One of the smallest girls, a child with eyes like a startled sparrow, peered out. Her gaze fell on Lena, and in it was a flicker of something other than fear. Lena's focus shifted instantly from Jacob to the child. Her entire posture softened. The exhaustion in her face was replaced by a wave of profound, aching compassion. She took a half-step forward, her hand slightly raised in a gesture of gentle reassurance. "Hello," she said softly to the child, ignoring the formidable man beside her. Jacob watched, silent and rigid. He saw Lena's gaze sweep past him and into the cabin, where she could now see the other girls huddled by the fire. He saw her register their wounds, their fear, their smallness. He saw the deep, instinctual well of nurturing that rose in her, a force of nature as powerful as the coming storm. Her eyes met his again, and this time, her plea was not for herself. "They need a woman's touch," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "Let me help." Jacob's own gaze shifted to the little girl in the doorway, who had not retreated. He looked at the others inside. He looked at his own calloused, clumsy hands. He gave a slow, reluctant nod, stepping aside to let her pass. Lena entered the cabin, and it was as if a candle had been lit in the darkest corner of a forgotten room. The air shifted. A fragile hope, unbidden and unwelcome, began to take root in the barren soil of Jacob Thorne's heart. The cabin, once a silent tomb of memory, slowly began to transform. Wyoming Territory, Thorne Homestead, late autumn, 1878. The first snows had dusted the high peaks, a stark white warning against the deep gray sky. Inside, a quiet rhythm established itself, orchestrated by Lena's gentle persistence. She moved through the small space with a grace born of purpose. Her first act was to heat water, her movements efficient and sure. She carefully unwrapped each girl's bandages, clucking her tongue softly at the angry, inflamed wounds beneath. She cleaned them not with Jacob's brusque haste, but with a tenderness that was itself a kind of medicine. She tore strips from her own petticoat to make fresh dressings. The girls, who had flinched from Jacob's touch, gradually uncoiled under hers. They watched her with wide, observant eyes. Lena began to mend their clothes, her needle and thread a small, steady metronome marking the passage of healing time. Each stitch was an act of devotion, a silent promise that what was torn could be made whole again. Jacob watched from the periphery, a silent sentinel. He chopped more wood than was necessary, his axe swings falling with a fierce, percussive rhythm that seemed to answer the quiet industry inside. He saw the way the smallest girl, whom Lena had quietly named Little Sparrow, now followed Lena around the cabin. He saw the way another girl finally allowed a small, hesitant smile when Lena praised her drawing in the dirt floor. He felt a profound and unsettling mix of relief and inadequacy. He had offered them shelter, Lena was offering them a home. One afternoon, as a cold rain lashed against the windows, Jacob sat at his small table, carving. He worked a piece of pine, the knife moving with practiced ease. Little Sparrow crept near, her eyes fixed on his hands. He didn't look up, but he was acutely aware of her presence. When he was finished, he placed a small, intricately carved bird on the table. It was a sparrow, its wings half spread as if about to take flight. He pushed it silently toward her. The girl stared at it, then up at his face. Her tiny fingers reached out and closed around the wood. It was the first gift he had given anyone in 10 years. The narrator's voice would gently reveal Jacob's past. We see it in his eyes as he watches the children, the muddy fields of Shiloh, the cries of wounded men he tried to save. We feel the ghost of his wife, Sarah, and the unborn child they lost with her, a grief so immense it had frozen him in time. These girls were not a replacement, but their vulnerability had chipped away the ice around his heart. The news of the Indian children at the Thorn place eventually trickled down to the town of Redemption. One day, a rider appeared. It was Silas Blackwood, the man Lena had fled. He was flanked by 2 hired hands, his posture arrogant on his fine horse. Blackwood was a man whose wealth was built on the land he'd taken and the people he'd broken. He saw the world in terms of possessions, and he considered Lena his. His cruel gaze landed on Lena as she stood protectively near the cabin door. "So this is where you ran," he sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. Hiding out here with this hermit and his savage pets, Jacob stepped out onto the porch, placing himself between Blackwood and Lena. He said nothing. His presence was enough. His hand rested on the cabin wall, his body a silent shield. Blackwood's eyes narrowed. "They don't belong here, Thorn. This is white man's territory. Send them back where they came from, or I'll have the whole town out here to do it for you." Jacob's voice, when it came, was low and cold as river stone. "They are home," Blackwood laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that grated on the quiet air. "We'll see about that." He wheeled his horse around and rode off, leaving a trail of threats hanging in the air like dust. Jacob's jaw was clenched, his knuckles white where he gripped the porch post. The fragile peace had been shattered. The world he had tried so hard to keep at bay was now coming for them all. The sky mirrored the growing dread. Wyoming Territory, Thorn Homestead, early winter, 1878. For days, bruised purple clouds gathered over the mountains, and the wind carried a new, sharper menace. The threat from Blackwood was a palpable thing, a sickness in the air. Inside the cabin, a tense quiet had fallen. Lena moved with a heavy heart, her eyes often straying to the window, watching the tree line. The girls sensed the change, their brief moments of laughter silenced, replaced by a huddled, watchful stillness. Jacob was no longer just a woodsman, he was a soldier again. His movements became economical, purposeful. He checked the sturdy bar on the door, the latches on the windows. He cleaned his old service rifle, the scent of gun oil sharp and metallic in the small room. He was not preparing for a fight he wanted, but for one he knew was inevitable. He was protecting more than a piece of land now, he was protecting a life, a fragile, nascent thing he hadn't realized he was building. He and Lena worked as a unit, their communication almost entirely nonverbal. A shared glance across the room was enough to convey a plan, a fear, a reassurance. He would bring in a stack of firewood, and she would have a hot cup of coffee waiting. She would organize their meager medical supplies, and he would nod his approval. They were 2 solitary lighthouses that had found themselves guarding the same shore. The storm broke the day Blackwood returned. It came with a furious onslaught of wind and sleet that lashed the plains. And through the gray, swirling curtain of ice and rain, they appeared. Blackwood and a dozen riders, their faces grim and set, their hearts filled with the cold poison of prejudice. They were not lawmen, they were a mob. "Thorn!" Blackwood's voice was nearly torn away by the gale. "Send out the woman and the savages. This is your last chance." Jacob turned to Lena. His eyes, for a moment, lost their hardness, and in them she saw a deep, aching regret that it had come to this. "Take them to the root cellar," he commanded, his voice steady. Bar it from the inside. Do not come out. No matter what you hear. Lena gathered the terrified girls, herding them toward the trapdoor in the floor. Little Sparrow clutched the wooden bird Jacob had carved, her knuckles white. Before descending, Lena looked back at Jacob. Her own fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but her voice was unwavering. Be safe, Jacob. He gave a single, sharp nod. The door to the cellar closed, and he slid a heavy crate over it. He was alone. He took his position by the window, rifle in hand. The riders were dismounting, spreading out to surround the cabin. The confrontation was stark and brutal. Jacob fired a single warning shot over their heads, the crack of the rifle a thunderclap that momentarily silenced the wind. This is my land, he yelled, his voice raw. They are under my protection. Leave now. They're abominations. Blackwood roared back, his face contorted with rage. You're a traitor to your own kind, Thorn. The assault began. They charged the cabin, their intent clear. Jacob, a man who had seen the horrors of war and prayed never to see them again, was forced to become what he had left behind. He was not aiming to kill, but to disable, to drive them back. He moved with a grim, desperate efficiency, from window to window, a ghost of a soldier fighting for a cause far more personal than any flag. He fought with the fury of a man who had already lost everything once and would not do so again. But he was 1 against 12. The door splintered under the force of an axe. Glass shattered. Just as the first of Blackwood's men scrambled through a broken window, the sound of another horse, ridden hard, cut through the din. It was Marshal Thompson, his face a thundercloud of fury. He was alone, but he carried the weight of the law. Blackwood, he bellowed, his voice carrying an authority that stopped the mob in its tracks. In the name of the United States government, I order you to stand down. You and your men are under arrest for armed insurrection and attempted murder. Blackwood stared, dumbfounded. The marshal dismounted, his shotgun leveled. I delivered those children into this man's care under federal authority. You are attacking a federal ward. You've made a grave mistake. The fight drained out of the mob, replaced by a dawning, sullen fear. As the marshal began to disarm them, the storm finally broke, the sleet turning to a gentler rain. The battle was over. In the aftermath of the storm, a profound quiet descended upon the homestead. Wyoming Territory, Thorn Homestead, winter, 1878. The rain washed the world clean, leaving behind the scent of wet earth and pine, a baptism for the wounded land. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with the smell of splintered wood, spent gunpowder, and relief. Marshal Thompson, his duty done, had departed with Blackwood and his shamefaced men in tow, promising that justice would be served far from this quiet corner of the world. Jacob stood in the middle of the room, surveying the damage. He was bruised, cut, and utterly exhausted, but he stood taller than he had in a decade. He was no longer a ghost in his own home. He was its guardian. The cellar door creaked open, and Lena emerged, followed by the 10 girls. Their eyes took in the scene, the shattered window, the broken door, the weariness etched onto Jacob's face. There were no words. Lena went to him, her movements deliberate. She carried a bowl of water and a clean cloth. She began to tend to a long cut on his forearm, her touch infinitely gentle. Their hands met, and this time, it was not accidental. It was a connection, a silent acknowledgement of the bond forged in shared adversity. He looked down at her focused, compassionate face, and for the first time, he let her see the vulnerability behind the stoicism, the gratitude that his hardened heart felt but his lips could not form. As she worked, Little Sparrow approached him hesitantly. She held out the small wooden bird he had carved for her. It was clutched so tightly in her hand that the shape was imprinted on her palm. Then, she did something that breached the final wall around Jacob's heart. She leaned forward and wrapped her small arms around his leg, burying her face in the rough fabric of his trousers. A quiet, ragged breath escaped Jacob's lips. He slowly, carefully, rested a hand on her head. It was a benediction. In that small, simple gesture, a family was born. Not of blood, but of shared wounds and the fierce, stubborn will to heal. the man who had sought only silence, the woman who had been cast out, and the 10 children who had lost everything had found it all in each other, in a battered cabin at the edge of the world. An epilogue unfolds over the next year. Spring arrives, and with it, the sight of Jacob and Lena planting a garden, the girls helping to pat down the soil over the seeds. Summer shows Jacob teaching them to read the signs of the forest, while Lena teaches them to read the words in a book. The cabin is expanded, a new room built by Jacob's hands to give them space. The sound of quiet laughter becomes a common melody, replacing the silence of grief. One evening, a year later, Jacob and Lena stand on the porch, watching the girls play a game in the twilight, their forms silhouetted against a sky painted in hues of rose and gold. The air is peaceful. Lena leans her head against his shoulder. He covers her hand with his own. "It's a good life," he says, his voice soft with a contentment he once thought impossible. Lena looks up at him, her eyes reflecting the twilight's glow. "Yes, Jacob," she whispers. It is they had taken in 10 wounded souls and, in doing so, had healed their own. They had built more than a home, they had rebuilt a world. If this story of a family forged not by blood, but by courage and compassion stirred your heart, it reminds us that the deepest connections can be found in the most unexpected places. It shows that even the most broken spirits can be mended by the simple, powerful act of protecting others. We create these stories to touch upon the threads of hope and redemption that connect us all. If you felt that connection, we invite you to become part of our community. Please subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Join us for more stories that explore the strength and resilience of the human heart.